Hello, everybody. A few days ago, we had my old New York City-based friend, Mika Sifry, on the show talking about the hopes for Democrats in the age of Donald Trump. He notes that Trump isn't popular, but Sifry's career is in technology and political organization. He has an excellent Substack called The Connector. And we talked about how to organize against Trump or perhaps reorganize. He also has an excellent podcast called This Old Democracy. My guest today is interested in similar subjects, how to resist perhaps, or how to do something. He's the co-author of a book called Somebody Should Do Something, How Anyone Can Help Create Social Change. Michael Brownstein teaches at John Jay College, and he's joining us from his closet in Brooklyn. Michael, congratulations on the new book. I'm guessing metaphorically, most people in Brooklyn are sheltering in their closets these days. Is that fair?
No, not fair at all. Thanks for having me. We're out and about. I was just walking home from the grocery store with my daughter, and I saw about 15 different people knocking on doors for Zoran Mandani. So it's a busy day.
It's a busy day, a busy time for political activists. What's your thesis, Michael, in Somebody Should Do Something, how anyone can create social change? I know you suggest that there's a science to this. I'm always a bit wary when people use science to justify what they're arguing. What is the science of bringing about change?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I'm not sure I would even say there's a science of social change, but there's definitely a lot of relevant work in the social sciences about what motivates people to make change and how they can do it more or less effectively. And so we bring a lot of that to bear, from psychology to political science to economics in the book. But we also do a lot of storytelling from the history of people trying to make change through social movements and collective action of all different kinds. And so the thesis of the book is that a lot of us face a dilemma when we see complex systemic problems in the world, whether it's climate change or racism or income inequality. We look around and we see that those problems are massively complicated. And it raises a question about what I as an individual can do about it. Sometimes people call this the do-gooder's dilemma, that what I am in control of as an individual can feel insignificant, whereas the real problems feel out of my control and untouchable. And so the thesis of the book is that there are ways to think of our individual choices as more directly in connection with systemic change. And so we offer a bunch of tools for thinking, drawn from the relevant sciences, drawn from the history of social change, for how to see ourselves in closer contact with making a dent in those big systemic structural problems.
You bring up climate change, an enormously controversial subject. We've done many shows on it, and we've had a number of scientists, both perhaps progressive and less progressive, arguing that it ultimately, for example, it doesn't make any difference whether you drive an electric car or recycle your food or walk to the store. How does this determine your argument in Somebody Should Do Something? We're all inspired, particularly these days in the age of, seems to me at least, self-evident global warming, to do something. We've had shows, for example, on nuclear power. Some people are very skeptical of that. Some people are even scared of it. So ultimately, how can we determine whether or not, when it comes to something like climate change, which, as you note, is incredibly complicated and quite controversial, that we can know what we do, whether it's, I don't know, installing solar panels or going to live in a cave, is the right thing to do?
Right. So the people who said it doesn't matter whether you recycle or drive an electric car as an individual are the jumping off place for us in the book, because we get their skepticism. And in fact, there's a long history of fossil fuel companies and related industries manipulating the public conversation around these problems, whether it's climate change specifically or the history of environmental problems, or even traffic fatalities. In the early days of the automobile industry, car companies did the same thing, which is they framed the conversation to put the onus of change on individuals. So, for instance, in the 1920s, they came up with the term jaywalker to characterize somebody who was irresponsibly walking in the city, so that if they got hit by a car, the thought would be it's their fault, not our responsibility as the people making the cars. And that comes all the way up through the famous personal carbon footprint concept, which was popularized by BP. And so we really tell that history of what some scholars call responsibilization, which is really just the idea of putting social problems on the shoulders of individuals to solve. So I don't want to disagree with the people who were concerned with the idea, but of course, oftentimes people are much better at telling you what not to do than telling you what to do. And so it's clear that me throwing the plastic bottles in the recycling isn't going to make a dent in the massively global, complex problem of climate change. But there are different ways to think about what I do as an individual. So, for instance, if I drive an electric car or I put solar panels on my roof, one way to think about that is literally how many carbon dioxide molecules am I not putting up in the atmosphere because of my own little individual contribution. And if you think about it that way, it can be pretty disillusioning. But another way to think about it is, what effect can I have on other people by making those changes in my life? And what effect can I have even on my future self, who might then go on to do other things, even more impactful things? And so this is where the social science comes in, because there's lots of really fascinating literature showing that when people take what seem like small actions, they have the potential to create the situation that affects other people's choices. So one of the very best ways to predict who's going to put solar panels on their roof is if their neighbors have done that. And so it's a different way of thinking about individual action. It's not just like, how big of a drop in the bucket can I be? It's, what sort of a role can I play in a social network, in a community, in a neighborhood, to help be part of a collective action? And so there's lots of different examples, but in climate, that's one of them.
Is your argument specifically for progressives? I know most of the writing you've done, we'll come to an interesting op-ed you had in the New York Times recently, is directed at progressives. But what about a conservative, for example, or somebody in the MAGA movement who picked up your book? Somebody should do something. If they're concerned, for example, about the number of, at least in their words, illegal immigrants in America, is your book specifically for progressives, for any citizen who cares about issues, and how to determine how we analyze whether or not we should do something? Are you suggesting that perhaps acting against illegal immigrants is the wrong thing to do, whereas getting solar panels on your house is the right thing?
So I won't hide from the fact that I hope progressives and liberals more broadly pick up the book and read it and find it useful in their endeavors to make the world a more just place. Those are my politics. But there's nothing inherent to the ideas we put forward that could only contribute to progressive or liberal political ends. And in fact, we tell stories in the book from conservative movements in the past where I think progressives and liberals ought to learn lessons from them. So one is the history of the National Rifle Association, and how they managed to create a social identity around gun ownership and then leverage that social identity for legislative success. And it's really an astounding victory given how unpopular their ends are. So large majorities of Americans want all kinds of different regulations on gun ownership. But for decades, the NRA managed to stymie that because they were such good organizers. So we ought to learn those lessons. I mean progressives. But I don't think the story we tell is inherently liberal or progressive. Whatever change one needs to make or wants to make is going to involve motivating and inspiring people to work for it and to work for it effectively. And the lessons we draw out are really sort of aimed in that direction.
It's an old subject, of course, Michael. You don't need me to tell you this. In his famous June 1966 Day of Affirmation address in South Africa, which is known now as his Ripple of Hope speech, RFK talked about, and I'm quoting him here, he said, "It is from numberless diverse acts of courage and belief that human history is shaped each time a man stands up for an ideal or acts to improve the lot of others or strikes out against injustice." I'm sure you're familiar with that speech and the principles behind it. Is this a theme that you're trying to resurrect in this new book of direct action, of each citizen doing something, RFK's Ripple of Hope? Or are you adding something new to the argument?
Well, I think one of the things we're adding new, I mean, I don't think we want to pretend that we've reinvented the wheel here. There are lots of ideas that we're drawing on from history and that have come back and forth into public consciousness. And I'm happy to be in the same lineage as Kennedy and others. But I think what we add that's new is a lot of the contemporary social science. So there really is quite a lot going on that helps substantiate the recommendations we make. And one that I haven't mentioned is just a real coalescence around the idea that human beings are far more social and disposed to social influence than we ever realized. So we have a chapter in the book about human nature and about what we think is a rough consensus forming around a sort of different picture of human nature, of human beings really being what we call inside out creatures in ways that I think is new and is fascinating. And so we use that kind of on its head, which is to say, if it's true that we are far more susceptible to social influence than people have realized, that also means that we are potential purveyors of social influence. We are each of us is capable of creating the situation that other people are making their decisions in, and that can be a place to stand from, if not for hope, at least for empowerment.
The book, Somebody Should Do Something, was, of course, written. It came out last month. It was written before the Charlie Kirk assassination. Although I'm guessing it was written, or at least when you were thinking about it, you were aware of the Luigi Mangione assassination last year. Are you concerned at all, as a professor of philosophy, Michael, that younger generation are beginning to think that they have some sort of right to violence? I'm not suggesting that the Kirk assassin or Luigi Mangione are typical of their generation, but there was a very interesting, I think it was a Pew report released recently, which suggests that the younger demographic is much more skeptical of the value of democracy and much more open to the idea of violence. Now, Mangione and Kirk's assassin, of course, were progressives. I'm guessing that you could probably find the same amongst conservatives, amongst whom Kirk was very successful with young conservatives. But is part of the book, at least its subtext, suggesting that we shouldn't even contemplate violence when it comes to bringing about change or resisting something like the Trump regime, which many consider profoundly immoral?
So we don't do a lot of talking about violence in the book. Most of the forms of social change we're focused on, or I say all the forms of social change that we're focused on in the book, are nonviolent civil action. I think the way that I think about the increase in political violence going on right now, and some of the data that you're speaking to about young people's attitudes toward democracy and political change more broadly, is that there's none of, like, in the same way that you pointed toward ideas about social influence and hope being around for a long time, I think ideas about democracy and about political violence, they've been in the currency of American history forever, and they come and go in terms of their popularity. They're activated by salience in the news, and a lot of that has to do with what the social norms of a particular time are making seem acceptable. So we do write a lot about social norms in the book. And one of the things that I think is scary right now is the way in which violence seems to be increasingly thought of as an acceptable form of behavior. I do think that the cases we're seeing are of typically, you called them progressives. I guess they seem like oddballs more to me. They don't really fit into our political categories. But the bigger picture is that the social norms we want to encourage are social norms supportive of democracy, supportive of uh, working through differences in peaceful and in deliberative ways. And there are real interesting lessons to learn about how to promote social norms. And I think that brings the conversation back to what we can do in our communities, in our neighborhoods, in our workplaces, in our families to help promulgate the norms that allow us to get along peacefully.
So some people might be listening or watching, Michael, and thinking, well, the American democracy is all about civil engagement, citizen engagement. People can join their local communities. Tocqueville, of course, famously wrote about it. Join their local political communities. They can, their parties, their school boards, their city councils. Everybody has an opportunity to vote every 2 years. There'll be a midterms coming up next year, then another presidential election in 2028. The title of your book, Somebody Should Do Something, suggests perhaps that democracy isn't enough. That just the right to vote every 2 or 4 years isn't sufficient to bring about social change. So it suggests perhaps a degree of skepticism about the architecture, the current architecture of American democracy. Is that fair?
I don't think it's quite the framing I would give to the project. I don't think democracy is just a matter of voting every 2 or 4 years. All the sorts of civil activities you listed in the beginning of your question there are important aspects of democratic life. And I think the problem, one of our most pervasive problems in this country, but probably not in this country alone, is bystanding, is people having beliefs or opinions about the kind of world they want to live in, but not doing anything about it. And one reason why people don't do things about it, don't get engaged in democratic civil life, is that they don't think they can make a difference. And so the framework of the book is to talk about lots of different examples, some of the ones that you just mentioned, and show how some are effective, some are less effective, and show how they can be effective in ways we don't often think about. So that's, I don't think it's a commentary on democracy itself, but it's a commentary on how we as individuals can help a democracy flourish in ways that again, I think often sort of fall out from the picture for at least those of us who have been in the kind of conversations we've been in.
What do you make, Michael, of the fact that so many Americans don't vote, that they don't participate in the formal democracy? Yeah. I mean, I guess there's two interpretations. One is that the architecture of formal democracy is, as I touched on earlier, might be irrelevant, archaic. On the other, they're just preoccupied with other things, with Facebook or Instagram or sports or working 3 or 4 different jobs. In other words, somebody should do something suggests that we all want to do something, but there's a more pessimistic, a bleaker version of human nature, particularly American human nature, that suggests that most people simply don't care.
Yeah, so I guess I would say 2 things. I mean, one is that we offer a description of a picture of human nature where what it is for humans to have a nature is to be cultural. That is our nature. And so I don't think at the end of the day, human beings are fundamentally selfish or lazy they are the things that they learn from their communities, from their families, from the norms in their culture. And so one of the ways that we can frame a problem of like why don't enough people vote is because because they don't either see a reason to, the barriers to doing it are too high, but it's those are not insurmountable problems. Those are problems in the in both the systemic the setup that makes it, you know, hard to vote for some people, especially if there are laws preventing them from voting or making or putting barriers in their way, and those are things that we need to figure out how to change. Or they might not do it because, again, they think it doesn't make a difference. You know, the academic problem of voting, the academic sort of way that scholars have studied voting, which goes by the name the paradox of voting, is that it's really, like, if you look at it in a cost benefit analysis, an irrational thing to do. The chance that any one of us is going to turn the tide of an election or be the deciding vote is almost nil. So we have to figure out other reasons to vote. And most of the scholarly literature shows that when people do, they do it because it's an identity. They think of themselves as a voter. They think of themselves as a member, again, of a community, or as somebody who believes in democracy, or even just somebody who like wants to be seen by their neighbors as doing their part. And so thinking of it that way, again, shows the cultural aspect of this. And then the question is, how do we seed the right norms? How do we shape the culture in a way that reduces bystanding and increases participation?
Is there, I mean, you're a professor of philosophy, so I can ask you a philosophical question. Is there a philosophical ideal at the heart of this? Somebody should do something, that when we do something, we reify, shall we say, if that's the right word, what philosophers once called, or one philosopher called, our species being. You noted that we are, by definition, for better or worse, social creatures. So by trying to do something, we make ourselves human. And of course, the issue of being human, particularly in our AI age, is an existential question that many people are concerned with. In other words, to prove ourselves as human beings, or to make ourselves human, we have to behave as humans do, and that involves doing something about something you care about in a social sense rather than just an individual one.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I guess the way that I would put that idea, if I understand it, is that we create the identities that we define ourselves by through our actions and through our choices. And that leaves it open for determination for what kinds of people we want to be. And so, again, I think oftentimes people get stuck thinking about, like, well, is it worthwhile to go knock on doors or go vote or bike to work or drive an electric car, or whatever it is, because they're thinking of just the sort of material impact of that thing. How many minds am I going to change by knocking on doors, or how many gallons of gasoline am I going to save by riding my bike to work? But really, fundamentally, what we're doing when we're making those choices is we're defining the kind of creatures we want to be and the kind of communities that we want to live in. And so I think the philosophical project behind the book is to put that idea in service of making the world more just.
Are there two competing philosophical ideas at the foundations of American Constitution? Maybe the Madisonian one, that we behave purely out of self-interest and form into factions to pursue our own interests, and then perhaps a more collective, maybe Jeffersonian one, borrowed in a way from Aristotle, noting that we are by definition political beings. So that you're suggesting that Jeffersonian, maybe that's the wrong word, but that collective promise or ideal at the heart of the American project is one that you want to resurrect and remind people that we're not purely Madisonian creatures of appetite.
Yeah, I guess the way I would say it is that the picture we want to put forward is one in which individuals can see themselves in collective action, in the systems and the structures and the institutions that shape and organize their lives. There's a long history in philosophy in the social sciences of trying to theorize how individuals and systems interrelate, right? How individuals are shaped by the social world, and the social world is then in turn shaped by individuals. None of that is new. But what we're doing, which I think is new, is taking that idea of this interacting relationship between individuals and institutions and trying to show how, if you want to make the world a better place, if your aim is to be a social change entrepreneur, how can you put that interrelation, that idea that each of us is part of a system and the system shapes each of us as individuals, to work and make it something that isn't a roadblock to action, isn't the do-gooder's dilemma where you say, look, I know how to recycle, but I don't know how to take down the fossil fuel industry, and reframes it as a motivational, inspirational framework where we really see ourselves as part of those systems and structures that in turn shape our lives.
So there's a kind of theatrical quality, I think, to what you're arguing. You had a very interesting op-ed in August, late August of this year, and it seems ages ago now, given how politics changes so quickly and we become preoccupied with different issues, why the Texas Democrats walkout worked, and they walked out over redistricting. But you suggested that losing loudly, and of course, from a progressive point of view, that's what happened amongst the Texas Democrats. I'm quoting you, the Texas Democrats lost, but losing loudly is the thing in itself. That's what you shouldn't necessarily celebrate, not winning and losing, but this theatrical quality of trying to change the world is what we need to embrace. Is that fair? That you're trying to suggest that we're all kind of on a stage here, and it's not really about winning. It's about playing the game. It's about participating and doing it in a noble kind of way.
Yeah, I like the way you put it, that we're on a stage, and I think we often don't realize that we are. And I think that's true whether you're a state representative in Texas or whether you're just an ordinary person who's around your family or your friends or your coworkers. So the idea for that op-ed came from a discussion that Dan and Alex and I have in the book about research on people who speak up in really repressive places, places where they're really putting their lives on the line. So some of that research looked at people, for instance, in the early 2010s in Hong Kong, in Turkey, in Russia, and it was looking to figure out what their psychological profiles were. And what the research shows, some of it is unsurprising, that people who speak up in those kinds of places they believe the system can change. They question the status quo. But what it also shows is that they don't think that they're going to be the pivotal person. They don't have like self-deluded beliefs that they're going to be the one who changes the fate of their country or the world. Instead, what they believe is that they can make a difference to their activists, right? To their neighbor. If they show up, maybe they can help the person standing next to them. They feel a sense of commitment. And the idea gave rise to our thinking about what the Texas Democrats were up to, because of course they knew that in walking out to try to prevent the mid-district gerrymander, they were going to lose that fight. So a special session could be called. There was no world in which they were going to leave the state and win the immediate battle. But what I think motivated them was, of course, the goal of bringing attention to their cause and demonstrating the justice of what they were up to. And in that sense, I think they did succeed, right? Shortly after they walked out of the state, California and New York announced intentions to try to retaliate. And regardless what one thinks about the specific strategic moves for reactive gerrymanders, the broader lesson to draw is that when people show up for each other and fight a battle that they know they might lose in the short term, they really have a power for bringing attention to their cause. They really have a way of demonstrating the authenticity of what they're up to. And so that's how we sort of drew the dots between what we wrote about in the book and the Texas case.
As a kind of martyrdom, in a sense, I guess, in this argument. In your excellent op-ed in the New York Times, you refer to John Lewis and other civil rights heroes who led peaceful marches to the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama in 1965. They knew, as you note in the piece, that they were going to be savagely beaten and tear gassed, but they still do it. Is this, in a sense, I mean, I'm not suggesting that any time you recycle or try to change the world, you're behaving like John Lewis. We're not perpetually on that Pettus Bridge, although perhaps in Trump's America, some people think they are. But is there a degree of martyrdom here? Is that a good thing? Or perhaps are you, given that we're theatricalizing political action, are you perhaps over theatricalizing it? I mean, every time we do something, we're not behaving in the heroic way that John Lewis and his other civil rights heroes behaved on that bridge in 1965.
Yeah, theatrics can definitely backfire if they come off as inauthentic or sort of ill-conceived in various ways. I think what the literature shows is that theatrics are important and they're successful when they put pressure on the opposition, when they put people in a position they don't want to be in, to have to respond in ways that that create costs. So I think Lewis and other organizers of the civil rights movement knew this and knew that by framing their nonviolent non-cooperation as the opposition to the police officers who were sicking dogs on them and shooting fire hoses and so on, they put pressure on segregationists to either have to back down or to look really terrible in the public eye. And so I think one of the questions moving forward, because you brought up sort of where we are in Trump's America right now, the question for organizers and activists who are trying to figure out what the most effective tactics right now are is whether or what kind of theatrics can put pressure, can force leaders in the MAGA movement to have to choose between bad options. And I think we're seeing some successful efforts there and some not so successful efforts, but I think that's in sort of one of the fulcrum points that the history of nonviolent civil resistance literature shows.
Yeah, and I think the emphasis should here be on nonviolence. Of course, as we speak, who knows, Trump may have moved on to other obsessions by the time this comes out, but he's currently talking about the deployment of troops to Portland. I'm guessing that one way of responding would be a non-violent one, a Gandhian one, or an MLK style one. I mean, we're not talking about meeting violence with violence, are we?
No, definitely not. I mean, I think the evidence is clear that would be, leaving aside its moral problems, ineffective. And so, if I had to take a optimistic, give an optimistic take, which I do with a lot of caution, I think it would be something like the move to send federal troops or the National Guard or whatever to Portland is such an absurd overreach that if met with nonviolent civil resistance, it could really backfire on Trump and really make them look absurd. Now, again, I don't want to be in the position of being the optimistic predictor, but I don't think that's an impossible outcome.
Finally, Michael, there's a wonderful new film. I'm not sure if you've seen it. One Battle After Another features Leonardo DiCaprio, and it's built on Thomas Pynchon's 1990 novel Vineland, and it's a slightly satirical take on the idea or the promise of revolution from the 1970s. It could be from the 1960s as well. It's still a progressive film, and I think it does a very good job representing what's happening in America today, especially in terms of the rounding up of people who are not formally papered, and the rise of one kind of racism or another. But there's, I'm going to call it cynicism. Their skepticism can be justified in terms of the history in America of those kind of movements, can't they?
You mean revolutionary movements, like from the 60s and 70s?
Yeah, the Weathermen and organizations like that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean,
have you seen the
my
film,
take
by
is
the way?
No, I haven't. I've heard about it though, so
I think you'll enjoy it. It's an excellent film.
Yeah, that's what I've heard. I'm eager to see it. One of the themes that we write about in the book is what we call an anti-incrementalism bias. And I think that's where I might look to understand some of the more radical revolutionary moments, the Weathermen and so on. Many of the greatest moments in American history that have promoted fairness and equity and justice um, have been big asks that have ratcheted up slowly over time, and then equally as important, have been implemented slowly over time, where people stuck around to make sure it works. So, like, think about Social Security or something like that, where there were successive bills over many years that that slowly made it more and more of a robust program, and one that people relied on and supported. Compare that to something like prohibition, right, which is as revolutionary as a change you can get in the United States short of Civil War, right? They amended the Constitution of all things, but they never won people's hearts and minds, and 11 years later another amendment ends it.
Well,
So
that's interesting. In the case of prohibition, of course, it was a majority of women who seemed to be backing it. The idea of prohibiting alcohol was seen as something that would save women from being beaten up by men and that sort of thing. So
and for good reason. Actually, there's evidence that violence against women declined in the years of prohibition. So it's a complicated story for sure. But the point I was just trying to make is that there's through some clever experiments you can show that when people set a goal and they define a threshold for success, right? You could think about it like dieting. I'm going to reach whatever number weight or whatever. Even if they get really close to that goal, but they don't cross the threshold, they're liable to think they failed. And they'll even be willing to say that they've failed just as much as someone who didn't get nearly as close to the goal. And that's a kind of bias against incremental progress. And to me, I think that's at play in some of the more like we've got to burn it all down factions in American history. And in some ways, what I'm talking about here and what Dan and Alex and I write in the book is meant as a alternative to that, a way of seeing how to do the work over time that can really lead up to big change, but takes slow, steady progress.
Well, there you have it. No more excuses. We can all help bring about social change of one kind or another, something we care about. Somebody should do something. How anyone can create social change. It's by Michael Brownstein, my guest today, and Alex Madver and Daniel Kelly. Congratulations, Michael, on the book. And I think now we all need to go out and change the world. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. It was a fun conversation.